There we go.
All right, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of a YouTube channel, Everything Drug and Alcohol. And we have a wonderful, wonderful, great show this time for you where we're going to really dig into an outstanding individual in the industry, just well known. So when you guys look at this, make sure you save it, keep it, take a listen, learn something, learn something. And as you heard in my previous intro, this is no surprise to who we have. So everybody, welcome Dr. Donna Smith.
Thanks, Greg. Good to be here.
Finally, we have all these technical difficulties. So how are you and where are you?
I am right now in Tampa Bay, Florida, with our typical daily thunderstorm with lightning and boomers just having passed. So hopefully I'll be able to stay on air with you while we get through that. But no hurricane yet. So that's good.
Is it one on the way?
No, not that I know of. So
Oh,
hopefully.
okay. Gotcha. Well, welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you. I've been dying. I've been telling everybody, hey, I'm about to have Dr. Smith on. I'm about to have Dr. Smith. And because I'm here in Dallas, doing some work with American Airlines. So Tiffany told me to tell you hello.
That's good because I think Tiffany and I just exchanged a couple of emails again earlier this week on some matter. So not surprising.
Yeah, so she told me to tell you hello. So without further ado, I know you having may have technical issues over there at some point, and I don't want to, hold that up. So tell us the beginning of Dr. Donna Smith. Like most people know you from conferences and all these other things, but where is Dr. Smith from? Where did
Well,
you
I
grow
was
up at?
actually, I'll go back to the very, very beginning, Greg. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I'm a Pennsylvanian by birth, and went to college in Ohio, did graduate work in New York City, did my doctorate in Muncie, Indiana, so kind of all over the place. And then career-wise, I spent my career all over the place because I was married to a active duty Army officer, a chaplain. And so in his 23 years, we were living in 7 states, 3 foreign countries. I felt like the moving van was my best friend. So I did work for the Department of Army. I did work in college teaching in various places, and really started in the drug and alcohol field, if you will, as a clinician with my psychology degree, my social work degree. So I did, basically treatment, outpatient treatment for the Department of Army for active duty personnel and their families. Later on, then moved into the policy end and the prevention and education end associated with drug abuse. And although most people probably know me from my career with the Department of Transportation beginning in the late 1980s, actually 89, 88, 89, I really cut my teeth on drug testing and alcohol testing with the Army's program in the late 70s. So was involved there. So, and most people don't realize that the military drug testing program really was a foundation for what we later then developed for the federal agency testing under the Reagan executive order. And then a couple of years after that, under the Department of Transportation rules. So the military was the first one to put high speed throughput urine drug testing laboratories in place, for example. Military,
So
go ahead.
go ahead.
And the military was the first to use widespread deployment of evidential breath testing devices to test for alcohol misuse for people that may have been impaired or under the influence while at work. So that was really the start. And then obviously was in the developmental stages of the federal drug testing program for federal agencies, and then for the Department of Transportation.
Wow. So I'm trying to listen to you and see where I'm going to pick this apart at, because it's just a lot of stuff there. So let's go back to the 70s when you talk about the military.
Yeah.
And when that happened, were you a part of developing the drug testing portion back then?
I was initially I was in the treatment end, and then when the Army decided that it needed to put together a drug testing, alcohol testing program, that was when I took an administrative position, if you will, a policy position at the U.S. Army headquarters in Europe. So then I worked with a lot of folks in the Army. We built a laboratory in, in Wiesbaden, Germany, for example, for the drug testing that would be done in Europe. I worked with the Medical Service Corps and the Medical Corps of the Army to train and put together medical review officers that would review drug test results. So that was really kind of the foundation, and that was in the late 70s.
So what made them go that route? Was it Vietnam, coming back from Vietnam? Like what kicked that off?
A lot of it was Vietnam, with soldiers coming back addicted, and particularly heroin was the major drug that was impacting readiness, that was impacting vets' recovery, if you will, and integration back into society. But also, and it's interesting that we would talk about it now because we're having a lot of discussion about marijuana. Well, in Vietnam was not just all heroin, because hashish was a primary drug that was used by probably at some point 70 to 80% of U.S. forces that were stationed in Vietnam. And of course, the psychoactive components of hashish oil, were much greater than the cannabis that we saw in the U.S. then in the decades to follow. So that was really where they decided that they really needed to have a broad scale approach. It was not just enough to try to find intervention methods, but we needed to concentrate on some prevention and deterrence methods. And so that's where obviously where drug testing came in. And the big headlines then in the mid 70s was there was a disastrous, it was the US Navy, there was a disastrous air carrier crash, and multiple deaths and loss of 9 or 10 planes, etc., on the aircraft carrier. And when the Navy investigated all of that, they found that again, that crash was due to the fact that several of the personnel who were responsible for landing that aircraft, catching it in its, rubber bands, we used to call them,
Right.
right? They were under the influence of hashish, of marijuana at the time. And then further, they looked at it, and it wasn't isolated, that it was just, those 8 or 10 shipment, but in fact was a systemic issue in the Navy. So Navy led the way and said, we gotta get rid of this. It's affecting morale, it's affecting safety, readiness, military readiness, and we've got to address it.
So at that point, like because they're testing as requirements for those who don't understand, because our world now, we're more DOT, right? And these capacities, and we don't really talk about DOD and military testing in
Right.
our world now within DASA and DASHA and these conferences or whatever. So this is going to be interesting, I guess, for a lot of people to understand this process of, DOD,
Yep.
testing, right? So
And
we
it
know
was the
that
beginning.
DOT is the split, specimens and such and such. What made the Army or the military go to everything being direct observed and single cup collection versus everybody else? And the second part to that you can answer is, now they don't do alcohol. When did they just stop doing alcohol when they were part of that whole process?
Well, the alcohol testing was never a part of their urine testing program. It was always separate with either blood alcohol draws or with breath alcohol testing. So that was not a part of the early on program, if you will.
Okay.
It was focused on urine drug testing, and it was focused on the 5 illicit drugs uh, to begin with. But with your question though about collection procedures, the laboratories, as I mentioned, they did have uh, a real push to put together military drug testing laboratories that could test, hundreds to thousands of specimens a week, that they could do it economically. And it was really the DoD labs that developed the high throughput original immunoassays that they could screen specimens rapidly, quickly, if you will. So the collection, however, because in the beginning, it was what we call unit testing. I mean, it wasn't a random selection. It wasn't just of certain members of the military. It was enlisted, it was officers. And on a given day or a given time, a battalion, a company of troops would be simply lined up at the first call in the morning, and the sergeants would take them off. They would go to the urinals. They would stand at the head of the urinal. The sergeant would,
That was me.
and on the command of 1, 2, 3. Okay, guys, whiz, right? And the soldiers were holding their cup. They would pee in the cup, and then they would process them on a single group chain of custody. Greg, I mean, that, we can't comprehend that now with all there is about the custody and control form and the individual. But so the service member's number was written next to, and that's what was put on the cup that was sent off to the military drug testing lab. And that batch, if you will, was then summed up by the sergeant who had done the observations, and by the commander of that unit. And off they went to the laboratory, the military testing. So that was a very different thing, that it was a group chain of custody document, but it was the beginning of forensic procedures, if you will, for drug testing, from the laboratory standpoint, and from the collection and the documentation of the security and the identification of a urine specimen with a specific individual.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was a trained UPL, unit prevention leader. I actually had to go to Fort Meade to get
Right.
Fort Meade the lab, right?
Sure.
And get trained at Fort Meade. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, I did have to do that. They called me the pecker watcher.
See, there were all kinds of quote euphemisms, right, for the procedures. Yeah. So that's really how it did start. And had it not been, quite frankly, for the experience that the military labs had for going on almost 10 years, okay, which is when the executive order for testing of federal employees came into place in 1986 under former President Reagan. And that executive order specifically said it would be urine testing, it would be forensic urine testing, and that HHS had to develop standards to certify, inspect, and be able to attest to the precision and accuracy of the laboratory testing. And again, that was all the foundation was from those military drug testing labs, like the one that you were trained at in Fort Meade, Maryland.
So after that, right, you transitioned from there, and that was your first taste of drug and alcohol program
Yes,
there.
was in the Army. And then I went to the Department of Defense at the Pentagon, a little bit higher level. And then we were developing at that time, expanding the drug testing to not just the military personnel in the Army, Air Force, and Navy, but we were writing regulations then to test certain civilian populations in the military, so that civilians who work for the Department of Army, the Department of Air Force, the Department of Navy, who had what were considered security, critical, or safety sensitive jobs, they were going to be subject to drug testing. So that took a whole different set of regs because, again, it's a whole different, as you know, it's a different system of, quote, justice and due process that
Right.
a civilian is entitled to versus, a uniformed military member.
Right.
So that was where I was involved in that kind of regulation writing, if you will.
So keeping a track on the military before we transition from there, because there's an interesting entity that borders that fence, right, between DOT and the military, which is the Coast Guard, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yep.
are you like, I'm sure you are. So expand on how they got involved with being HHS/DOT, and because that is very confusing to a lot of people, especially when they have to run records checks, because most people think they're the branch of the military, but they're Department of Homeland Security, but they do DOT testing. So can you navigate through that?
Yeah. And the Coast Guard's always been the unusual animal, even, in terms of from my a uniform service military. They are not considered a U.S. military coming under Department of Defense, except in wartime.
Wartime.
Okay. So that's when they were under DOD. So, and they, and under Department of Defense from a personnel, a policy standpoint, etc. Now, then, of course, when the with everything that happened with 9/11 and protecting the ports and all of that from terrorism, that's when they transitioned over in peacetime to the Department of Health and the Department of Health, Homeland Security. So before that, in peacetime, because their job was, okay, to inspect commercial transportation vessels on US waterways, that's what made them a DOT entity. Is that making sense?
Right.
Just like the FAA is the regulatory safety agency for commercial aviation. So the US Coast Guard was the entity for safety and marine, commercial maritime safety and operation. So they, therefore, the Coast Guard regulation that started drug testing in 1989 was the Coast Guard that applied to all commercial maritime operations that
Right.
are a U.S. flag that are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Coast Guard for maritime safety. And therefore, as a DOT agency, one of six, that was required by the NTSB finding and the Secretary of Transportation to put in place drug testing, they fell under Part 40 procedures. And so then when 9/11 happened, and they were from I guess you would call it from a bureaucracy standpoint, they were assigned under the Department of Homeland Security. They still kept their requirements for following 49 CFR Part 40 for the drug testing of Coast Guard, of personnel on commercial vessels. Now, the military, the uniform coasties, the coasties who wear the white uniforms or the whatever, their testing is entirely different from the drug testing that is done under the Coast Guard rule for people who work on commercial vessels, whether they're on tankers, whether they're on charter vessels, whether they are on tugs, whatever they're on. So that's always had that split, if you will, in some way.
Yeah, I think I knew it threw me off when I looked at the annual testing rate after 21, and they fell off of the annual testing rate. And then
Yeah.
it was just like, okay, are they testing, not testing? Like, what are
Oh,
we,
yeah. Yeah. No.
what are we doing with these things? And people, I'm glad you cleared that up, because a lot of people they're just right there. And, what are they if they're not this, right? Should
Yes.
we,
Yeah.
or shouldn't we not be doing
So
this?
they have retained their, their drug testing regulation, which is a part of the Coast Guard Maritime Safety Rules. Okay, Part 16, Part 60, 46, and 4 and 6. That's all the same. Serious marine incident testing and all of that. And they have retained, so they didn't recodify their drug testing regulation to a regulation under Homeland Security. They kept it under marine safety. Is that making sense, sort of?
Right. And that's why they
And
kept that blurb down at the bottom of the annual
yes,
testing rate.
yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's interesting. As they're an interesting branch of whatever they are.
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
you know,
Certainly the definition of a hybrid auto, they're really a hybrid agency, right? Yeah, from the beginning.
a little bit of this, a little bit of that, just molded it together. Okay, so moving forward from there, so you go from, all of that. Now, is this when you make transition to DOT?
Yes, from the Pentagon, working for DoD with putting together these civilian testing programs for the various branches of the Department of Defense. And then kind of all bets were off. I mean, Department of Transportation, there was the only testing that was required as a result of the 1986 executive order were for civilian employees of the Department of Transportation who were in what are called, and still called today, testing designated positions. But
Right.
there was no testing required in the quote private business sector of transportation. It was only Department of Transportation employees under the Executive Order 12564 and Public Law 100-71. So that was what all came into place in 1986 and 87. And so the development of that, and then again with certifying laboratories, the National Laboratory Certification Program came into being. And then, boom, what happens? And this again, particularly relevant for today. On a clear, cold day outside Washington, D.C.
So
in January.
I was about to ask you what actually happened, the crash. Um, because I promised you, like, probably some months ago, whatever, I was trying to find these stories and whatever on Google, like, how did this what really happened?
Yeah.
Because
So
you're
it was a
getting it.
crash. It was a crash between or a crash accident outside DC, pretty close to Chase, Maryland, which is like a distant exurb, if you will, of DC.
Right.
And it was an Amtrak and a Conrail train. And that was the crash that occurred. The Conrail train, cargo train pulling, I can't even remember now, Greg, the number of cars, but at any rate, it's just zipping along. I didn't even know until I read all of the 360 some pages of the investigation report, but locomotives, you can put them on like cruise control. Okay. So it was on cruise control set at the 55 mph or whatever it was speed limit as it's zipping along. And it simply ran through 3 different signals on the track telling it to stop or to divert onto a siding because there was a train ahead of it 6 miles that was disabled and unable to move. But the engineer, the conductor, and the brakeman on that Conrail train were too busy smoking marijuana, sharing a couple of joints, and drinking a 6-pack of Bud Light. And so on duty, while the train was on auto pilot, auto engineer, whatever, cruise control. And by the time they saw that the Amtrak train was several hundred feet in front of them, well, you know that expression, it's pretty hard to stop a speeding train, right? And I'm sure that their first words were, there were probably only two of them, oh, whatever, right? As
Emoji.
they attempted to stop the train, but they were unable to, and they crashed into that stationary Amtrak train going over 50 miles an hour, killing 19 and injuring scores, and obviously causing millions of dollars in damage. So then, as a result of that, when the FRA, remember, we didn't have any drug testing, okay? Although FRA was an agency that did have some accident investigation uh, uh, rules, if you will, that did enable them to have for cause to take blood samples, etc. Okay, and the NTSB and the FRA reports both concluded that the cause of the accident was not, engine or equipment failure. It was not track sabotage. It was not, anything like that. It was, in fact, human error caused by the fact that the Conrail employee, the Conrail trainmen, were under the influence of alcohol and or drugs at the time, and therefore unable to respond to the necessary safety measures to avoid the collision. So NTSB, in its final report, said to Secretary Elizabeth Dole, Transportation, she said, "This is it." She said, the NTSB said, it's not enough just to say, okay, we prohibit drug and alcohol use for on-duty people that, blah, blah, blah. You've got to put in place a comprehensive plan that includes education, that includes supervisory training, that includes reasonable suspicion, of post-accident, and random and a comprehensive drug and alcohol testing program. And so NTSB, in its report, even though that accident involved only a train, which was under the FRA's jurisdiction, the NTSB said that there was ample indications from previous NTSB investigations of crashes and accidents that this was not limited to train, that it was in fact a problem with transit. It was in fact a problem in aviation. It was in fact a problem, particularly in commercial trucking. And so their directive was, it's across the board. So you as the secretary must put this in place. And so that report came out in 80, accident was in 87, the early part of 87. That report was actually out by the end of the year. And so then by 88, the 6 agencies under Elizabeth Dole's, under the secretary's jurisdiction to regulate safety, published regulations for drug testing.
Well, I'm glad you cleared that up, because there's the rumors that Nancy Reagan and war on drugs were an influence to Ronald, former President Reagan, with the whole timing, right?
Yeah, no, this definitely was not a, this was not a program. Now, certainly Reagan's program, which was the executive order in 86, that was in turn, and I think his famous sentence is from that the federal government, as the nation's largest employer, will lead the way in an anti-drug campaign, right? By putting in place drug-free workplace policies and programs throughout the executive branch of the government. But that was entirely separate, to be honest with you. And that affected, as I said, that affected the few hundred Department of Transportation employees, and it did actually affect at that time the air traffic controllers because they were federal employees. Okay. So anyway, but then the testing that affects American Airlines, Schneider Trucking, Conrail Transportation, Metro, whatever, those were all a direct result of the NTSB's directive to the Secretary of Transportation.
Is this all kind of just connected
Well, yeah, I mean, the timing is right.
the timing? Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So now we're considering in 2024, I can't do the math. How many years is that from 1987? A lot. And now we're saying marijuana may not be that bad. We may not need to test transportation workers for marijuana. And of course, I'm sitting back here screaming and saying, do you know where this all began? This didn't begin because of Nancy Reagan and her astrologers. This didn't begin, right?
Right.
Because of the military's preoccupation with rooting out drug abuse in the military post-Vietnam. This began specifically because of fatal accidents and crashes that were directly attributable to the drug marijuana.
Yeah. So when did you get tapped to be a part of 4940 development of that regulation?
Yeah, that was in late 88, beginning of 89.
What was that? What was that like? Like, how did that happen? You know, because first of all, everybody, we don't meet people that write regulations most of the time or deal with these federal things or be a part of these things. So I'm just in awe right here talking with Dr. Smith about this type of stuff. So if you're in this industry, you know exactly what I'm talking about. How did that happen? You just so nonchalantly with it, just like, oh, that was back in 1988, whatever. That is a huge deal. Like, how did that come to you? And, how was that process? Because that couldn't have been easy.
Well, no, it wasn't. But and of course, the Secretary of Transportation was going, "Hey, we don't, we got to put this together. We've got to write these regulations. We've got to go through. We know we'll go through lawsuits, so we have to be able to defend the regulations that they are going to be constitutional, that they are going to meet legal and forensic muster." And so I'm going to need people on my staff to do that. I have people that know how to do stuff with transportation policy, but this is way out of the stream, if you will, of the expertise that we currently have at the Department of Transportation. So initially, me and two other people were detailed from jobs that did have some knowledge of writing regulations, okay, that involved drug-free workplace programs, drug testing, alcohol policy, etc. So I was detailed from the Department of Defense, my office in the Pentagon, okay, to working at the Department of Transportation under a political appointee that Elizabeth Dole appointed, and Terry Gaynor was his name, and his background in this was that he came out of law enforcement, so he had some background, if you will, because even back then there was drug testing that was done in conjunction with crimes. There were state crime labs and that kind of thing, and so he became the head of the first Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy and Compliance. I think we were called the Anti-Drug Office or something like that, but anyway. And so there were initially four of us, and then that expanded, and we plugged through and worked very closely with the Office of General Counsel, Neil Eisner and Bob Ashby, and wrote Part 40, which was to be the procedural rule. And then in each DOT agency, such as the FAA and the FRA, there were staff put together usually in the safety department, or in the case of FAA, of course, it was in the medical department, right? In the
AME.
Department of Aviation Medicine. That's where they chose to house it. Each DOT agency kind of decided where they were going to put that within their structure. And so then they wrote the the regulations for the industry. And we in the secretary's office on his staff wrote the Part 40 procedural rule. And initially the Part 40 rule was very simple. I mean, it was only a few pages, well, maybe 20 or so pages, not compared to what it is now. And again, the focus was threefold from the beginning. And this was borrowed from the military testing. I'll go back to what I just said about the military testing. How do we collect a sample, identify it, secure it, right? And ensure that it is a valid result? How do we test that specimen? In other words, what are the laboratory criteria? And then the third part, how do we review and interpret that laboratory result? Does the laboratory result in and of itself mean that a person used an illegal drug? We know it doesn't. So, and that's why the medical review officer. And again, Greg, I know that you figured this part out probably before. Why do we call it a medical review officer? Because who was the first reviewer of those drug tests?
Yeah, Pecker Watcher.
Yes, right. Yeah. So there you go.
So what is the relationship and how did the divide come between SAMHSA's role and DOT role?
Okay, SAMHSA's role as it relates to drug testing under the Department of Transportation's regulations has always been limited to the laboratory portion. They were charged with that original Public Law 100-71, and then Congress reiterated that relationship in the OTITA, remember, the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act, which of course wasn't until 1991. So we're talking, 15 years later, essentially, right? And the OTITA legislation, again, tied Department of Transportation drug testing specifically to the SAMHSA, HHS, Health and Human Services. SAMHSA is an agency of HHS, tied that directly to those guidelines. So that any testing that DOT was going to do under the authority of OTITA had to be in sync with and done in accordance with the laboratory procedures, the cutoff levels, the drugs, everything else having to do as it was outlined in the mandatory guidelines for federal workplace testing. Now you remember too, Greg, because you're probably old enough, I think, maybe. You remember those original HHS guidelines weren't called the SAMHSA guidelines. Do you remember what they were called?
No. Well,
NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the NIDA.
I didn't get to them until later, after it was drug-free workplace.
After it had been transferred over to substance abuse and mental health. Yeah.
Yeah. Now moving forward beyond that, we go from there to now. How did you get involved with Workforce QA?
Oh my. Well, I finished my federal career in 1995, and so I would have probably stayed longer at the Department of Transportation, but my husband's military career was ended, and so he was relocating to Florida.
Okay.
And I thought that that was a bit of a long commute between Boca Raton, Florida, which is where he was going to be serving or be working as a clergyman, and Washington, D.C. So I then took a job with one of the first medical review officer companies called SAMI. It was called Substance Abuse Mental Health Incorporated, SAMI.
Okay.
And so then that company was sold to First Advantage. First Advantage then sold a portion of, spun that off to employee, how was it called? EDPM, Employee Drug Program Management, and which is a TPA and a medical review officer firm that was then purchased by Eric Quilter of Workforce QA. And so Eric Quilter always said, yes, we bought this company and we bought, we got 27 computers and whatever, and one Donna Smith. So I was kind of sold. All right. I was sold to Workforce QA.
All right. What is your role there?
I'm the chief compliance advisor. And so my role there is making sure that from drug and alcohol testing perspective for our federally regulated employees, be they a federal agency or a Department of Transportation, that everything that we do for those clients is in accordance with the applicable regulations. I advise our clients, whether that's an airline or that's a trucking company, when they have a particular compliance question. I assist them with modifying and revising their policies as needed. And then I also am responsible for what I call the internal compliance. I make sure that our medical review officer staff, 5 medical review officers and 8 medical review assistants, that we're doing everything correctly. So that we're audited by the FAA or we're audited by the FDA, that internally we are in compliance. So I do both internal and client-centered regulatory compliance work.
Okay. So this is my last topic for you, and then I'm gonna hate to say, good night to you, but this is kind of important. The new direction with the marijuana. What is the main concern and fear, and why should people get out here and voice their opinions on, the survey that's, going out to say, hey, we need you to,
get your comments in. Yes, yes, yeah. It really is important, great. And I guess I can say that I would boil it down to 3 major points. Number 1 is that as it stands now, from a regulatory and a statutory, meaning law and legal perspective, if marijuana is rescheduled as a Schedule 3 drug, we can no longer test for it under federal authority, period, for any metabolite or substance connected with marijuana. Because remember that OTITA Act and that original executive order that talked about what under, federal testing, what it could test for and couldn't test for. It has always been limited to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs. So as long as marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, OxyContin are Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 on the controlled substances, under the Controlled Substances Act and schedule, we can test for it. Right. As a deterrent, as a detection, whatever. But once it becomes Schedule 3, we will not be able to test for it under DOT. When you say, well, okay, but so then that's not a really big deal, because companies can go ahead and test for it under their own authority, under their own policy. But here's the other thing, and this is bullet number 2, is that once that happens, then the National Laboratory Certification Program, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, can no longer inspect and certify the laboratories for testing for marijuana. So now you would be left with what? Oh yeah, we're going to go ahead and test for it. But when you go to court, you're not going to have the same backing in terms of, the validity, the accuracy, the precision, whatever, of that confirmatory test for one or more metabolites. So that is probably the other, quote, unintended consequence. The third unintended, or the third consequence, I think, and why it's really important for people to comment, is that marijuana, it does not look like there is anything in place at FDA as a way to regulate, to approve or to evaluate the efficacy, the safety, the adverse reactions, or the adverse impact of using this biological material, this plant material, as medicine. 38 states have medical marijuana programs. Have you ever seen one, Greg, where they say take X amount of, this medicine, this dosage, this frequently in this form? And by the way, THC content has to be limited and is regulated at this. No, there's no structure for doing that. So that means that marijuana as medicine, if you will be different than anything else we've ever done in this country with regard to the approval of medications. So those are the three things that I think are just central. And there's no question that they should throw in that, there is ample evidence that marijuana is in fact detrimental to cognitive and motor functioning within a certain period of having ingested it. Do we know what that period is? That may be only 2 hours for me. It may be 24 hours for you. It depends on whether you're eating half a bag of marijuana edibles or whether you are vaping it. We just don't know.
And what they're lacing it with, because, if you're not testing for it, I'll be doing a tour of a marijuana facility in Utah, and I'll be doing a live from there, where we're working with them to try to develop a THC-free, component for it, because my thing is that if you really want the municipal portion of it,
yes,
then if this can happen without the THC with the different CB components, then if you're still kicking against that, then you're not really trying to find the municipal effects of it. You really want the high.
Right, exactly. Exactly. When the research that we have in terms of for things like joint pain, for things like anxiety, whatever, the cannabidiol is effective, right? But why do they put THC in it? Because people want the,
like cigarettes, right? It's the nicotine, it's the
sure.
addiction.
A lot of people have compared the U.S. cannabis industry today in the 21st century to exactly what big tobacco did 25 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And we see where that's at today, right? Yeah. So before we go, I normally do this with everybody. I want you to leave the audience with your closing thoughts about anything.
I guess what I would say is that looking back over 30 years, I am absolutely convinced that workplace programs are effective and they are necessary. I mean, I really do. I think that they have reduced drug use. I think that they have reduced accidents and incidents that are related to drug use. And I hope that we don't give up that fight, that this is still a very major part of workplace safety. There's no doubt in my mind that, and that's why I'm still working at this age, is because I really believe that the programs make a difference. And I hope that those that are involved in the industry share that commitment.
Right. And I can attest to that, because when you're at these conferences and somebody says something that isn't right, you're on it. you are like, hold up.
Wait a minute. Hang on, that's not exactly true.
And everybody just loves you. So,
thanks, Greg.
Really appreciate all you've done for this industry. And I really just wanted to have you on to give you your flowers, to say thank you so much for everything that you've done.
Well, I appreciate being with you. Okay.
Yes,
have a good night.
I'll see you in SAPA.
Yep, for sure.
Okay. I'll see you there.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.